Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lecture 1 focusing on violence against women. The documentary that we're going to be watching for this module is the 2015 documentary The Hunting Ground, which focuses on sexual assault across college campuses and really mostly focuses on the failure of college campuses to adequately deal with the situations as well as provide due process and justice for survivors. It's important to note that while this documentary does focus on very what we would consider big universities, big private universities, big state universities, know that the situations that they're talking about, the incidences as well as the problem, is happening across colleges across the country, as well as community colleges and other private universities. So I just want you to know while you're watching this that it's not isolated to these schools that are depicted in the film. The documentary does focus on Annie E. Clark and Andrea Pino, who are two former University of North Carolina Chapel Hill students who were the first to file a Title IX complaint against UNC in response to their sexual assaults while enrolled. The use of Title IX in campus sexual assault from their cases has become now a model for universities across the country, as well as a platform to advocate for students, as well as to address sexual assault on campus. I want to set the context when we're talking about violence against women and really sort of talk about how it is an epidemic. Global estimates published by the World Health Organization indicate that about 1 in 3 or 35% of women worldwide have experienced either physical and or sexual intimate partner violence or non-partner sexual violence in their lifetime. In the United States, an average of 1 in 4 women are survivors of sexual and physical violence, and an average of 3 women every day are murdered. Of all the women murdered in the US, about one-third were killed by an intimate partner, meaning somebody that they know. And according to the National Center for Injury Prevention and Control, women experience about 4.8 million intimate partner related physical assaults and rapes every year. Less than 20% of the survivors sought medical treatment following an injury. And we're going to talk about this some more. I think it's important that as we go forward talking about violence against women, that we talk about it systemically, meaning that it's far too easy when we either read reports about a terrible act of violence against a woman to focus on the perpetrator in the sense of like, oh, that was a bad person, right? And again, not taking anything away that yes, if you commit a violent crime against anyone, whether you're male, female, anyone across the gender spectrum, you should be held accountable as well as be prosecuted in due process and justice for the victim. At the same time, there is this tendency, particularly in the media, to just sort of wash this down and say like, oh, there's just a couple of bad people. A lot of times a couple of bad men. Like there are perpetrators, a couple of them, and if we just sort of dealt with them, we either put them into jail or we get them rehabilitated or whatever, then violence against women will never happen. But truthfully, I wish that it was that easy, but in truth is that this society has bred so much about this violence against women that it's hard to separate the individual act from the society at large that very much perpetuates, condones, fosters the very elements that cause violence against women to occur. Take, for example, sexual harassment. Now, I often ask my students when I'm teaching this course in a classroom to tell me if any of them have ever been catcalled on the street. And I usually ask, students like, if you identify as female, have you ever been catcalled? And not surprisingly, a lot of the people raise their hands. And when I asked them for how old they were, it's not shocking, but it's true that many of them talk about being very young, 9 years old, 10 years old, so forth. When I ask students who identify male in the classroom if they've been catcalled, sometimes one or two raise their hands, but most don't. And The reason why I want to sort of talk first about sexual harassment is that oftentimes it is the sort of violence that gets dismissed of that, well, guys are being guys, or it's not a big deal, who cares they're shouting at you, or who cares they are flirting, or who cares they're entering your private space. It's not as bad as other forms of violence. But I would argue that sexual harassment, as I'm going to talk about in more detail, one, there shouldn't be a hierarchy of violence like that one is worse than the other. Instead, we should talk about how these violences are interrelated. That sexual harassment leads to other forms of violence against women. So, what is sexual harassment? Because I think this is a term that has been blown up and out of proportion within our culture to the point that people say things like, well, you can't even compliment a woman or say hello or talk to a woman without it being sexual harassment. Here's the thing, there's a real clear divide of what sexual harassment is versus any other sort of conversation you might have. So, sexual harassment is the unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, or other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature. And here's the thing, 1 in 3 women between the ages of 18 and 34 have been sexually harassed at work. So while though this is a big, huge occurrence, there is still an underreporting of sexual harassment out of fear, and out of fear of losing your job, as well as being rejected by your colleagues and so forth. Unlike workplace sexual harassment portrayed in films and pop culture that's really represented as overtly aggressive, sexual harassment in the workplace isn't always easy to spot. It can be a sexual comment in a meeting or even an insinuating Facebook message. At the heart of it, when we want to talk about sexual harassment, it's about making someone feel like a sexual object. We've talked a lot about in the other modules about sexual objectivity and how that has been very much portrayed towards women, where they're no longer valued as a person, but instead people are saying things, complimenting or only looking at their breasts or their butts or etc. This is what sexual harassment does. One, it objectifies a person as well as invades a person's private space by either a sexual comment or by physical touching. So it's interesting teaching this class now, post a lot of these new movements that have come out within the past 3 years. One being Me Too. And I think, it's interesting to see how Me Too has both been praised as well as vilified. At the heart of it, it's a pretty simple notion that if all the women who have been sexually harassed or assaulted said Me Too, we would one see just the amount. Because think about the numbers that I've told you about in the last slides. 1 in 3 women across the world will experience sexual physical assault. 1 in 4 women in the United States. So if we did the numbers and just looked at our population, there's a lot of people, a lot of women who've experienced ranges of sexual assault and as well as physical assault, harassment, and so forth. And that's a big problem. But oftentimes we forget about it. We erase it, we blame the people who've had that done to them, and we don't really see the gravity of the situation. And that's what Me Too is all about. Me Too was founded by Tarana Burke, and she began with just the phrase Me Too on her MySpace social network. And as part of the grassroots campaign to promote empowerment through empathy among women of color who have experienced sexual abuse, particularly within underprivileged communities, Burke created this movement online called Me Too. And she was inspired to use this phrase after being unable to respond to a 13-year-old girl who confided to her. Tara Burke has worked in many sort of organizations around helping particularly young women, young black women, and in this instance, a 13-year-old girl in her work confided to her that she had been sexually assaulted. And in the moment, Burke did not say anything, but she had later wished she had simply told the girl, Me Too. So at the heart of it, that is the movement, is around just bringing to voice the gravity of the situation and the amount of violence that women are experiencing across this country, particularly marginalized groups of women, women of color, women with disabilities, queer women, poor women, and so forth, where they are oftentimes doubly marginalized. As I said before, it would be easy, and I don't mean it flippantly, but it would be easy to sort of look at some of the most egregious cases of sexual assault, violence, harassment, physical assault, and so forth, and just focus on that, meaning that, there's some really bad people out there, and once they are gone, everything is okay. But the truth is that cases like Harvey Weinstein, who for years sexually harassed as well as assaulted women, Brock Turner, who sexually assaulted a woman on his campus and then got off with minimum repercussions, and Bill Cosby, who sexually assaulted and drugged women for years, is that these cases are, of course, awful, terrible, but they shouldn't be treated as, something that, you know, as special, or that if we just get rid of these cases, then everything is fine. Instead, we should talk about how everyday violence against women, how many sort of factors line up so that violence against women occurs, and occurs so often that 1 in 4 women will experience some sort of sexual or physical assault in their lifetime. So, in discussions around violence, whether that's violence against women or just violence in general, there has been this trend to sort of broaden this out more, to talk about it in the larger sense of gender based violence. So, what is gender based violence? It's sexual, physical, verbal violence directed towards individuals on the basis of their gender. So, and why there's been this move to talk about gender based violence instead of just violence against women or violence against men is that, we really also need to talk about how gender, and particularly the sort of stuff we implicate in gender, the norms, the rules, the valuing, that contributes to violence. Not only violence against women, but also violence against men. And very much at the heart of gender based violence is talking about how unequal power relationships between genders is a big contributing factor towards violence. And so a big part again is about also talking about the gender hierarchy and patriarchy, as well as rigid gender norms that place superiority on masculinity in men, and again, only a certain type of masculinity, a hegemonic masculinity, and then in return objectifies and inferiorizes femininity. If we want to talk about legislative interventions, and the hunting ground is going to be talking about one intervention through the Title IX, I want to talk about in this presentation another intervention that is very critically important right now, which is the Violence Against Women's Act. So, the Violence Against Women's Act is a landmark piece of legislation that sought to improve criminal justice and community based responses to domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking in the United States. Now, it had been on the sort of working through since the 80s, but it wasn't until 1994 that Violence Against Women's Act was passed. And it was, again, an effort to create a nation with an engaged criminal justice system and coordinate community responses against violence against women. So VAWA did a lot of things that were really important because prior to this, the way that particularly the criminal justice system and community response dealt with violence against women was very scattered and not connecting, and in fact left many women marginalized. So with VAWA and the passing of it in 94, there were a lot of new rules and programs implemented, such as community coordinated responses that brought together for the first time ever, and remember this is 1994, so not too long ago, the criminal justice system, the social service systems, and the private nonprofit organizations responding to domestic violence and sexual assault. So, for the first time ever, this federally passed law was meant to uh, coordinate these important features in any sort of society, in any sort of community across the United States: the criminal justice system, the social service system, and private nonprofit organizations. It also provided much more economic and as well as institutional support for domestic violence shelters, rape crisis centers, and other community organizations nationwide who worked every day to end this violence and to support victims. It also did something that was really important, which was to create federal prosecution of interstate domestic violence and sexual assault crimes. Because previously to that, if a perpetrator committed sexual or physical assault against a victim in one state, he or she could possibly, like, if they moved to another state or a couple states away, they could escape prosecution and not be forced to go back to that state to face prosecution. So VAWA made it so that if you commit a crime like this in one state, you will still be prosecuted even if you left this state. It also made it so that there was a much more cross-disciplinary, cross-statewide initiative, so that police forces from different states would also work together to make sure to get the perpetrator, make sure that they're processed, as well as bringing them into court, but also providing other protection orders. Because if you are a person who has a restraining order, if you file in one state, and if, let's say, for whatever reasons you move to another state, that restraining order would have been dropped. Therefore, then the person that you have the restraining order against could come and harass you, etc., or do worse. VAWA made it so that if you filed a restraining order in one state, that it would have followed you to wherever you go in the United States, so that protection would continue. Very important was around providing protections for battered immigrants, because for many, what they saw was that for many, particularly women who come in on spousal visas or work visas that are dependent upon their spouse, that it was that for them, if they were experiencing domestic violence, sexual violence, there was very little recourse for them to get away from their abuser, because if they got away from, let's say, their spouse who has the visa, they would could then be deported or lose their status and so forth. So VAWA made it so that those who experienced domestic violence could find protections and not be deported. And also a new focus on underserved populations as well as Native American victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. Now, here's the thing: VAWA has to get passed every couple of years, meaning that it's not something that's set in stone. So, in 2000, Congress improved on the foundation established in Violence Against Women Act of 1994 by adding some other important measures, such as identifying the additional related crimes of dating violence and stalking. So making sure that that when a perpetrator commits a violent act, that other violence acts that he or she have done will also count. So it's not something separate or dismissed. Very much creating a much needed legal assistance program for victims of domestic violence and assault. So creating and supporting and institutionally supporting as well as financially supporting the legal assistance program. Promoting supervised visitation programs for families experiencing violence. So definitely helpful for spouses with children escaping a violent partner. And further protecting immigrants experiencing domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking by establishing the U visa and the T visa, and focusing also on trafficked persons who are experiencing incredible amounts of violence. When VAWA was then reconfirmed again in 2005, they added more to the program, and also addressed a lot of sort of the gap areas around violence against women. And these things included creating provisions that exclusively serve to protect immigrant victims of domestic violence, but also include protections to alleviate violence against immigrant women. And very important, VAWA was at the forefront of working with service providers, criminal justice system, organizations, and so forth of developing prevention strategies to stop violence before it starts, as well as protecting individuals from unfair eviction due to their status as victims of domestic violence or stalking, creating the first federal funding stream to support rape crisis centers, developing culturally and linguistically specific services for communities, enhancing programs and services for victims with disabilities, and broadening VAWA service provisions to include children and teenagers. The last time it was renewed in 2013, um, there were more provisions added to this, again extending to marginalized parts of the community, specifically Native Americans and members of the LGBTQ plus community. So, providing law enforcement with better resources to investigate cases of rape, giving colleges more tools to educate students about dating violence and sexual assault, empowering tribal courts to prosecute those who commit domestic violence on tribal lands, regardless of whether the aggressor is a member of the tribe, because previously, before that, due to the loophole around tribal jurisdiction versus non tribal jurisdiction, individuals who were not tribal members could go onto a reservation, commit a violent act against a person, and then would escape prosecution because they would leave the reservation and therefore they would no longer be under the jurisdiction of tribal courts. They would be under the other non-tribal courts. So this addressed the very critical loophole in dealing with violence, particularly violence against Native American women, as well as continued relief for immigrant victims of domestic violence, and more sort of care and assistance for LGBTQ victims of violence. As previously mentioned, VAWA gets renewed every couple of years by the Congress. In 2018, due to the government shutdown and other sort of resistance around providing greater protections, particularly for transgender persons, VAWA was not renewed. It did receive a temporary extension as part of sort of the short-term spending bill, but expired shortly thereafter on February 15th, 2019. Since then, and currently up to now, VAWA has not been renewed. And it's now become a very much a partisan fighting over recent amendments threatening to bring reauthorization efforts to a standstill. This is a critical issue. As you can see how much VAWA covers, like what this means is that those funded programs, initiatives around criminal justice systems, rape crisis centers, advocacy organizations, and so forth have ended. And some of the most marginalized communities who face the most amount of violence, particularly Native American women, transgender individuals who have experienced some of the highest rates of violence of any group in the US, these protections will no longer, that VAWA sort of enabled for them, will no longer be there. This is why VAWA is so important and why it's something that as you continue forward, if any of this sort of stuff that you've been listening to or reading about, particularly violence against women, upsets you and you would like to see change, VAWA is one intervention that should be taken seriously since it does so much on a systematic level in addressing violence against women. It's important again to reinstate that men are also victims of gender based violence. It's far too easy to sort of create this binary language that only men are perpetrators of violence and only women are victim survivors of violence. Yes, when we look at the numbers around violence against women, that the large majority of it is men, meaning that men are perpetrators of violence against women. It's also important to state that men are also the largest portion in regards to violence against other men. At the same time, I really want to challenge you in this sort of binary language because, one, it's true that also women are perpetrators of violence, yes, to a much lesser degree, But it's important to state that women have had are perpetrators of violence against women as well as other men and so forth. Men are victims of gender-based violence. And because of the gender norms that we put on men, as well as the gender hierarchy and so forth, there's incredible amounts of underreporting in regards to violence, particularly sexual violence against men. I've shared this number before, but 1 in 10 men are victims of sexual assault. We suggest and expect that this number is actually much higher in proportion. There's just such an underreporting of this issue. Think again back to the mask we live in. We know now that, and it's very clear that men are victims of violence. Yet there's such an underreporting due to the shame and stigma about reporting this. It gets to again around gender. Like when we talk about violence, whether we talk about violence against men or women or so forth, that at the heart of this is around gender, particularly the gender binary and how it enforces both gender norms and rules, as well as a catalyst in regards to violence against those who do not fit so neatly in the gender binary. Trans individuals, people who don't fall neatly into the gender binary, as well as gender fluid individuals, are especially targets of gender based violence, precisely because they challenge gender norms and hierarchies. So, violence against transgender people are at epidemic proportions in this country, and unfortunately, there's still a lot of underreporting as well as misreporting in regards to violence. So, the numbers that we have are not all the numbers. Just this year, 7 transgender women of color were murdered in the first 2 months of this year, but we suspect that this number is actually even higher. There's just a lot of underreporting in regards to this. But it's also important to talk about intersectionality, especially in regards to race, because women of color experience violence at a much higher rate than white women. Just looking at this chart on rape and sexual violence, we see that particularly Native American women or American Indian women experience the highest rates of violence in this country. Coming forth then Black women, Hispanic, Latino, Chicano women, and then Asian Pacific Islander. So epidemic proportions of violence. As I said, and what the chart showed, Native American women experience some of the highest rates of violence in our country, where you have numbers from the Urban Indian Health Institute that 94% of women have been raped or coerced in their lifetime. 42% of women, Native American women, have attempted suicide at some point if they had been raped or coerced. 53% have lacked permanent housing. 34% have engaged in binge drinking after they were attacked. Only 8% of the rape cases ended in a conviction, and that's an important number. And 86% have reported being affected by historical trauma. And as we sort of look in our country, violence against Native women, 34% of American Indian and Alaskan Native women will be raped in their lifetime. That number is higher than the national average in regards to 1 in 4. And about 67% of sexual abuse related matters were declined by prosecution by the United States government. Meaning that while a large majority of women are experiencing, Native American women are experiencing violence, these cases are very rare in regards to ending in conviction. And the truth is that, violence against women is more than just the act. The act alone being horrific, whether that is sexual or physical assault, harassment, and so forth, because it continues forward and not only affects the person who is the victim of this violence, but affects their communities, affects their families, their children, their generations. It is why when we talk about violence against women and girls that we need to talk about its impact on a much broader scale than just the incident alone, because it is a symbol of gender inequality and social injustice, because its roots are in that. It does hurt, obviously, girls and women's bodies, minds, and hearts, but in that, then, when you do that, when you hurt somebody like that, it hinders their social and economic development. It also prevents women and girls equal participation at every personal, social, and political level, which affects us all, and reinforces other forms of discrimination, including based on disability, age, race, sexuality, HIV status, and so forth. And is extremely costly because when you have created this sort of violence against a person and their communities, it takes away their potential to uh, pursue their lives, their education desires, their career desires, and so forth. When addressing violence against women or just violence against anyone, we really need to also talk about the culture or the environment where that violence occurs. Because, again, if anything, I want you to sort of think about violence as not just incidents or isolated acts made by bad people or individuals, but instead talk about the culture and the environment which leads to these acts to occur and how it feeds into one another. So we have to then talk about the larger context of rape culture. So, what is rape culture? Simply put, rape culture is an environment where rape is present. So that means that rape is present. Turn on the news, look around you, rape is present. Therefore, we live in rape culture because it is something that is present in our culture. But at the other part of it is around how sexual violence is normalized to the point that we don't even think about it, as well as excused in media and popular culture, as well as in our politics and so forth. It's perpetuated through the use of sexist, misogynistic language, the objectification of women's bodies, and the glamorization of sexual violence. At the heart of it, this is what happens is that with rape culture, it creates a society that disregards women's rights and safety. Rape culture is about how we collectively also think about rape. And I want to give you a couple examples from my own life in regards to rape culture. I went to the University of British Columbia for my PhD. It's located in Canada. And in their MBA program, every fall when they brought in new MBA students, they would do this chant. The chant being Y is for your sister, O is for oh so tight, U is for underage, N is for no consent, and G is for grab that ass. So this was a chant that incoming freshmen at the Masters of Business School would chant because it has to do so much with business. And this was with female students in present. Two, of course, we can look at hundreds of examples of pop culture that tells women that you know you want it because of these blurred lines, meaning that you can say no as many times as you want. I know that I can get you to say yes, or I don't even have to care about that yes. To a woman's rape case being dismissed because she was wearing skinny jeans, which has happened several times, and therefore couldn't be raped in them. As well as supporting athletes who are charged with rape and calling their victims career destroyers. Journalists who substitute the word sex for rape as if it means the same thing. As well as 12-year-old girls being sexually harassed on the street. There's a lot of examples of rape culture that we can see, particularly from pop culture, but also within our politics, our news, and so forth. And again, at the heart of it is around devaluing women, devaluing their consent, their safety, and so forth. Ultimately, what rape culture is trying to explain is about how acts as well as cultural norms around gender and sexuality lead to violence, particularly violence against women. From things of like, boys will be boys, locker room banter, sexist attitudes, to even things like unequal pay, which at the heart of it is around devaluing women and normalizing that, right? Like, well, this is just the way that it is, to degradation in the sense of objectifying women, right? So whistling, catcalling, and so forth, to then going even further in regards to removal autonomy, so groping and sexual harassment and so forth, and then to egregious forms of violence. If anything, rape culture tells us what I've been telling you throughout this whole presentation is that violence against women is not just isolated incidents, it's the attitude and the actions from the bottom up that reinforce and excuse those higher up. And it's systematic. And if it is to change, if therefore the culture must change, and we must very much interrogate the way that we address, particularly violence against women, but also how it contributes to gender norms and etc. Because here's what rape culture contributes to. Assuming that false reporting for sexual assault cases are the norm, when in reality they're only 2 to 8%, the same amount of percentage as somebody doing false reporting for burglary or anything else. So basically blaming victims. To only 3% of rapists ever serving a day in jail. There we have low prosecution rates in regards to sexual assault. 2, of course, is a number that I've shared before about 1 in 4 women and 1 in 10 men having been reported being raped. And this number is doubled for trans persons as well as Native American women. So, what does it mean then to live in rape culture? If anything, I really like this picture because it sort of shows the real impact of rape culture around how rape cases are not being reported. Only a third of all rapes are actually reported. A lot of it is because either victims are turned away by the police station or by administrators or hospital officials, or they feel that that they're not going to be believed, or that there's going to be retaliation against them. And even if a survivor does report, police might not investigate. There are tens of thousands of rape kits across the United States who are untested. Prosecutors often refuse to take up rape cases that the police do recommend because they're just not easy, fun, winnable cases. Therefore, then fewer than 4 in 10 cases are ever prosecuted. If a rape case does go to trial, survivors are often re-traumatized by the process. Defense attorneys often blame and shame them. And people think therefore then that rape survivors are making this all up. That about 6 or less of charges may be false, but students think up to 50% of rape reports are fabricated. And even if a rapist is convicted, he or she can receive an extraordinarily light sentence. Only 3% of rapists spend even a 1 day in jail. How do we end rape culture? Well, at the heart of it is about rape culture exists because we don't believe it exists, because we normalize it. So name the real problems. For example, instead of when you hear something like, well, what was she doing, wearing, saying when she was raped? Instead ask, what makes him, her think this is acceptable? Examine and revalue masculinity and gender inequality. And get enthusiastic about enthusiastic consent. And at the heart of it, lobby your community. Care about things like BAWA and the ways that it has helped to particularly assist survivors of sexual assault as well as physical and domestic assault. Okay, everyone, on to the next one.